Okay, so we're back again with another episode, and what you've discussed is we'll be talking about moonlighting, right? So why don't you start about your perspective on moonlighting? What do you think it is, and then maybe I'll follow after that.
Okay. So, well, when we decided that we'd talk about moonlighting, I did a little bit of research just to check what is the background to moonlighting, because my earliest reference to moonlight was in I think a Mad comic, the Mad comics that used to come. In that, someone was referring to illicit liquor as moonlight, right? So that was my first exposure to the word, and so today I checked the dictionary. I think the Cambridge dictionary to see what exactly. I mean, I know the way it is being used, but then what is the background to the word? What is the actual meaning? So, moonlighting comes from moonlight, which is doing something in the light of the moon. So basically, doing something at night or in the evenings, or which is more or less post work time. Right. So moonlighting, therefore, as I understand, is something that you do at night, and because you have your primary employment during the daytime, well, most of us do. So therefore, what you do off the primary employment time would become moonlighting. Right. Has become a little bit of a talking point in India of late because of various IT companies coming up with that policy of we don't want you to moonlight. Right? They've come up with formal statements on that. Wipro, TCS, Wipro particularly. There was um, a statement by Mr. Asim Premji's son, current head at
Rishabh
Wipro,
Premji.
Rishad
Rishabh
Premji. Yeah.
Premji.
So he specifically said that we don't want people to moonlight. So therefore, to summarize, I think moonlighting is about having a dual career, right? Where there are aspects to it. I mean, there are multiple ways that you can look at it. There is obviously the legal aspect, uh, which we will discuss further. There is the ethical aspect also, right? And on top of that, there is a social aspect that we can look at, and a psychological aspect also. I see at least four angles that we could look at moonlighting from. So, uh, after you tell us your perspective, maybe we could look at each of those perspectives one after the other.
Sure, sure. That's a great viewpoint. I mean, this four aspects, I did not particularly think of it in this way at the beginning, but yeah, this would be interesting to explore. So, for my idea, exactly, I resonate with you. Basically, the term comes because it is about someone carrying out an activity after their 9 to 5 job, as we say, right? So, it's in the light of the moon that we do, and that's the term that it comes up from. So, and but this is not something new. This term, yes, the debate has started in India, but this is a very old thing, right? Our teachers used to do private tuitions. Doctors have their own private clinics. You will have industry professionals taking lectures at different universities, right? And that's basically there. Many people who are say passionate about photography, they do their own side gigs on the web. It has been going on for long. So that basically is moonlighting. It's slightly different from freelancing. In freelancing, you do not have a full-time job, right? In freelancing, you do not have a full-time job, and as a result of this, you are welcome to do as many gigs as you wish to, right? Till the point you have skills and you are not liable to anyone as your full-time employer. You can do as many jobs as you want in case of freelancing. Moonlighting comes when someone has a full-time employment, right? So they have this day job where they're full-time employees, and then anything they do beyond that job, that would come under the category of moonlighting, right? So that basically is an understanding of of moonlighting. Yes, and now we can talk of the different aspects that you told about. uh, why don't you first discuss why do employees even do moonlighting, right? And maybe you can then bring in those aspects that you wish to, and then I'll put my views on it.
True, true. Just a little side note. I had actually not thought of these four dimensions earlier, and this came up right on, I mean, in the flow. And this is something I had been discussing with my students last week, right? When I was discussing something with them, and I told them, if you need to look at completeness, right? How do you look at a situation and try to describe it in multiple dimensions? I said, in things like essay writing, you've got the pest analysis and things, right? Where you look at the political, economic, social, technological aspects, and you can increase that to include legal, environmental, all those points, right? What I was trying to drive through that, and which is what I applied here also, is that frameworks are there just to give you a perspective that, okay, I need to tick these boxes also, check on those aspects. So I don't know how much that registered with my students. I tried to drive it again and again, but let's see if any of the answers reflect a perspective like this. Then I get to know that they've also imbibed that. Okay, coming back, uh, you had mentioned that why do people do moonlighting, right? I think the primary issue, or when moonlighting becomes a problem, is when people do it for economic reasons. People doing it for their personal, or their personal reasons, personal growth, etc. That would not be termed as moonlighting, right? We would typically look at it as they're pursuing their interests. Right? Somebody likes photography and then goes ahead and does photography at a certain scale, starts selling those photographs. That's okay. We take it as their personal interest. But when the primary reason for taking up that second hustle, right? This is another thing. If you say side gig and moonlighting and a second job or a part-time job to the students today, the young kids today, for them it sounds very boring. But then tell them about a side hustle, and then they're like, "Yeah, okay, side hustle. That sounds cool." Right. So anyway, so when someone picks up
No, I was
a
going to bring up this word actually. It's hustle, the word. It's pretty much
yes,
intertwined, these two terms.
true.
Yeah, but yeah, please go on.
So when people take up a secondary employment with the intention of making money, one that uh, reflects multiple aspects, right? There again, we can look at the fact that maybe the employer is not adequately compensating them for their work, which is why they need to look at additional sources of income, right? Second, maybe their own expenses are the employee's own expenses are beyond a certain level, due to which they need to look at an additional source of income. Now, when that happens, when an employee goes beyond uh, the primary work that they are engaging in, it might also reflect dissatisfaction, right? They are dissatisfied with what they're doing right now. It might be paying them something, but maybe their expectations are much higher. Their expectations from themselves, from their income is much higher. Therefore, they start looking at an alternate means of income. Now, okay, one of the news articles that I was reading up on mentioned about how most of these new age IT companies were creating an issue, right? Infosys and stuff, people were creating an issue about moonlighting. They themselves started, the founders themselves started those companies while they were moonlighting, right? So examples being given are of the Bansals while working at Amazon trying to launch Flipkart, of the Infosys founders who, while they were working at Patni Computers, they were working towards launching Infosys also, right? So yes, they've been there, done that, but they might not want their current employees to do that. From Infosys, Mohandas Pai also has been a sort of a very vociferous proponent or supporter of moonlighting. That is another interesting perspective, because what he says is it is their choice, right? After work time, if they're indulging in something, what's the problem? Why not? Why shouldn't they be allowed to? I think I'll stop there. See if you.
Yes, agree. So the narrative that is going on, rather the debate that is going on in India, the brunt of it is being faced by the IT sector in India, right? And that's predominantly because of various comments that came up, be it from Rishabh Premji and many others, about moonlighting, right? And that's where the but again, if you talk of the reasons why they do it, I think there are three, four good reasons to it. One, of course, is the financial aspect to it. And one of the narratives or one of the aspects that, or a perspective that the supporters of moonlighting give is that Indian employees, especially in the IT sector, are very narrowly paid, right? They're not paid to the talent that they have, and so people need to have a sidekick. They need to moonlight to earn that extra income. So that's one aspect, the financial aspect to it. The second aspect is also about about passion. So someone has a passion that they want to follow, which of course perhaps is not allowing them to pursue it full time, right? They have a passion which perhaps they are not in a position to pursue full time, so they can't do that beyond their work hours. And the argument is that what someone does beyond their work hours is none of anyone's business. We have this specific 9, 10, whatever work hours we have, and you're doing a duty, so why can't we be allowed to do it beyond that? And the third one, of course, for many people is just to combat boredom, right? Many people want to combat boredom. In fact, I was just reading this up. There was a survey by Resume Builders, this is company, and they found out the top reasons for it. And the first two top reasons that employees cite, and it's a very recent survey, I think it's around 21 sort of, and that is specific to IT companies. They found that to increase investments and to pay off debts, right? These are the top two reasons why people say that they moonlight. They want to increase their investments and they want to pay off their debts. What follows after this is like factors like they want to gain more work experience, right? And then there's something that's about passion. The next reason, that the fourth reason that they cite is to pursue their passion, and finally it's about combating boredom, right? So if you see, the buckets are really it's about the financial reasons, to increase investment, to pay off debts, to also enhance lifestyle. Second comes to pursuing passion, and third for many is to combat boredom. So I think these are the like top reasons why people moonlight. And also I think for many people, it's like, if I have a skill, why can't I monetize it? Because I'm doing my day job, and irrespective of how much I do, there's a cycle to my growth, right? In terms of monetary link. And today, given the internet, given how distribution is so democratized, and I keep bringing this up, how distribution has been democratized by internet, people just think that why can't you do it, right? And this moonlighting thing really propelled during the work from home time, right? During the pandemic time, because traveling time reduced. People are in their home, right? Even in those working hours, people could manage their time. Say for 1 2 hours I'll work for my office, and on the side I'll put some time to my for my other job, other side hustle that I'm doing. At the end of the day, what matters is that whatever work I have been assigned, I'm doing that well enough, right? So that was the argument that has come up, and that's, I think, for proponents of moonlighting, that's really the reasons, right? Be it the financial reason, the pursuing passion, or combating boredom. Now the point is, yes, this is from the side of the proponents of moonlighting, but why do some employers, and I'm not saying all, because for example, you might be aware that Swiggy has in a
Swiggy.
way allowed moonlighting. Okay, and I think on 3rd of August they brought up this rule. Of course, there are terms and conditions, and we'll talk about that. But why do you think? What do you think are the concerns of some of the employers about moonlighting? And of course, some of them I'm sure would be genuine. So, what's in your view some of the concerns they
So,
have?
I would on what you had mentioned, and then before going into the employer side, there is a feature in the IT industry called being on the bench, right? Which is when an employee is hired, not assigned to an active project, right? So when an employee is on bench, he or she is literally getting paid for just coming to office, right? They're not involved actively in any project. And this is a feature of the times when the IT companies flush with funds and pitching for projects abroad. They did not want to have that lag time of hiring based on the requirements that come up, but instead hiring for the future. And then when a project comes in, assign the workforce to that. Right. So, and a lot of people who had dreams of going to the US with their new job, they ended up staying in India for 2 years, sitting on the bench, not doing anything, just because the project that they were supposed to get assigned to took time coming in. Right now, when you have an employee like that, right? that employee is definitely going to face boredom unless they are highly self-motivated, right? Ping pong tables and what cafeterias at IT companies can sort of take up their interest only for a certain amount of time. Beyond that, unless they're self-motivated, they would not feel satisfied. They would not actually be doing anything constructive for those 2 years, right? If Office allows Netflix, then they'll Netflix in Office also, right? But so in that scenario, boredom actually is going to be specifically from the IT industry a very important factor, right? Now, why would employers allow it? I think from an employer's perspective, for IT companies, if they have a large bench, right? Um, for them, I think it makes a lot of sense because if you do not have an active project to keep your employees engaged, then if they are working with someone else and working is experience, right? You are going to keep honing your skills. You can send them for 20 courses, right? But then they would come back with zero knowledge because they would not be applying them. If they are on the job applying their knowledge, applying their coding skills, learning whatever on the job, I think for the employers it is then a win-win situation because when an employee is on the bench, they do not they're not eligible for the variable, right? They just get the fix, right? So your cost goes down while at the same time your employee who is now tied to you is actually enhancing uh, their their skills, and somebody else is paying them for that, right? You don't even need to pay them and pay for those courses for them to enhance their skills, and they continue to be motivated. And somewhere because of aspects of psychology, they will always feel that yes, my primary employer is Infosys or whoever is that original employer, right? They'll always feel indebted to that company which is sending them that regular check home, right? So um, and therefore they ought to come back when the company requires. So if they do get that project and they get off the bench onto an active project, then they should maybe leave that secondary income that they've identified and come back to this. So from an employer's perspective, I think it makes sense for specific industries, right? Which is why they could allow it. For something like Swiggy, Zomato, which are dependent on the amount of, I mean, where the take home for the employee is dependent on the amount of work, right? How engaged can the company keep them? So cab drivers or truck owners, I mean, cab owners, truck owners, what they want to do and what they prefer is that they have two sets of drivers or three sets of drivers so that the car is always on the road, or the car or the truck is always on the road, right? Because when it is on the road, it is earning. When it is in the garage, it is not earning, right? And machinery, the more it works, the more it stays running, right? As soon as you park it, there'll be moving parts which will start getting rusted, jammed, all those things, right? So similarly, I would say for these companies also like Zomato or Swiggy, the more the employee is out there and working, the more the employee gets to earn, right? Whether they are full-time associated with Swiggy or they're working with someone else also, as long as the employee is making enough, they'll continue with that job. If they are not, then they'll think of switching, right? So when Uber and Ola, they all started in India, they paid out huge amounts of money. People bought cars and invested in cabs which they could drive themselves and things. But then when the payout started decreasing, people moved out. People who had bought those cabs, they sold those cabs, moved out, moved on to another. So there is this. Um, I mean, all these new age companies, they've brought in transitionary employment, right? So you work in an industry which is booming. When that boom goes, then you move on to another industry and you develop skills accordingly, right? It needs a dynamic workforce, but then at least there are people who do that. So if a delivery boy is there and um, is good at his or her job, then for Swiggy, even if they're doing multiple trips with for other companies, as long as they're doing it for Swiggy efficiently, I think Swiggy would also be happy. So that's my perspective. So about why employers would allow this, why employers would have apprehensions are something that's there. It hasn't been. I mean, it's been discussed a lot.
Yes, I agree. I guess employers also have clear advantages if they allow moonlighting. Of course, there has to be terms and conditions, proper terms and conditions to it. And I think that really tells us that the answer to it, whether moonlighting should be allowed or not allowed, is not a very yes and no answer. It's not a black and white answer. It's pretty much a gray area, and there has to be, and it will vary from one industry to one industry, from one company to another, right? But if you look at some of the concerns that employers have, and these are like basically four buckets that they have. One is a clear concern of conflict of interest, and I think it's a very legitimate concern. What happens if employee works for a given company full time, but also extends services to another competing firm, right? Based on his or her skills and knowledge. So there's a clear case of there can be a clear case of conflict of interest. The second, which perhaps is more dangerous, is what if employees pass on confidential information, the breach of confidentiality that we talk about. And I think that is even more dangerous, right? So these are the two most legitimate concerns I think that employers have when they talk of moonlighting. Other than this, another reason that many companies tend to have is that when employees moonlight, they tend to misuse company resources, right? Using company's laptop or devices that they get from the company, they tend to misuse that. And that, I mean, we know from our own practical experience that that usually happens. And the fourth reason which employers tend to have is that moonlighting will increase burnout, moonlighting will increase fatigue and absenteeism, right? Which in a way is also, I mean, not unfair to say. I mean, it's there, the concerns are there. But so basically, these are the four reasons why they say the conflict of interest, breach of confidentiality, your misuse of company resources, and finally, fatigue, burnout, absenteeism. Now, I think if we have now identified the reasons why moonlighting is a concern for employers, there lies also the answer to it, right? And here I'll bring in the legal aspect of it. If you look at Indian laws, it doesn't have the word moonlighting at all, right? It has the word dual employment, and that also what I have found in my research is that it's there in the Factories Act 1948, where they talk of that no employee should be allowed or can do dual employment. But again, that's in the context of factories only, labor in factories. This law does not pervade all industries, all contexts, right? So moonlighting, or for that matter, even dual employment, is not something that is universally applicable across all industries in India. So that gives the proponents of moonlighting a green light that yes, the legally we are safe. The ethical aspect will come to it.
Okay.
So from the legal aspect, they say what employees or employers can do to stop moonlighting is the only the job contract that they have. It's just the job contract where they can stop employees from moonlighting, right? And there are two basic clauses that every employee need to see whether they have it in their job contract or not. First is their single employment contract, right? That's the first thing. I mean, if in your job contract you have a single employment contract, that means you cannot go for moonlighting under any circumstances. And if you have this in contract, you have signed it, you cannot go for it. And the second one is the non-compete agreement, the non-compete clause, that you cannot work, or in fact, not just work when you are employed with me, you cannot even work with a competing firm even after resigning from me, resigning with me for a certain duration of time. Even some companies have that non-compete clause as well. So if these two clauses are there, right, or even if one of the clauses is there, for example, say the clause of single employment, you cannot moonlight, right? That's the basic fundamental to it. But if these two things are not there, then you are free to moonlight legally at least, right? Now coming back to the concerns that the employers have, if these four are and which we presume are legitimate concerns, I think what employers can do is that they can address that in the job contract, right? So for example, let's take the conflict of interest. So conflict of interest should be properly defined. I mean, we use this term quite freely, or I mean, yeah.
Casually.
Yeah, pretty casually use that. But this is something that has to be properly defined, and it will vary from one context to another. What conflict of interest someone means for their industry or company. So that has to be properly defined in the job contract. Uh, Breach of confidential information, again, that it also will come up in the non-compete agreement. So that also has to be clearly defined, and that should be there. Misuse of company resources, again, that can be put in the contract. And finally, fatigue burnout. Again, fatigue burnout is something that's a very psychological thing. You cannot, I don't think you can put in the job contract. In today's world, when hustle and side hustle is so such a thing now, I think this should be left to the employees, individual employees, to manage their workout, right? At the end of the day, every employer has certain targets that they want their employees to fulfill. So if, for example, if I'm hiring someone and I have this task that the person has to accomplish, say in a quarter, in a month, in a day, and if the person is doing that, I am okay with it, right? I should be okay with it. Beyond that, what the person does is completely his or her business, right? And I think that in this fourth point of fatigue or burnout or absenteeism, I don't think companies should interfere much. Yes, they can obviously provide counseling and everything. That's part of it. But I think this is something that we should leave to the judiciousness of the employees. But the other 3 points that I mentioned, this can clearly be written in the job contract. I mean, conflict of interest, breach of confidential information, or misuse of company resources, that can be clearly laid out in the job contract. And once an employee signs that, and now they know their boundaries, by adhering to these boundaries, if they take up a side hustle, if they take up a second job, I don't think any employer should have a problem with that, right? It rather shows them that they are a progressive employer. I think what Swiggy done is phenomenal. What Swiggy has basically done is that they are saying that we allow our employees to moonlight, but the conditions are they cannot work in the working hours of Swiggy, right? And that's fair. They can work in the weekends. We have no issues if you work in the weekends, and you cannot have conflict of interest. So basically, if you are working for Swiggy, you cannot give any services to Zomato or any other competing firm. And I think which is completely legitimate. If you maintain this few terms and conditions, you're absolutely free to do your moonlighting. If a Swiggy employee, for example, wants to pursue his or her passion in photography and earn money from it, what's the harm in it? Right? It's not directly affecting Swiggy's business in any way. About the burnout and fatigue, that's completely up to the employee how they manage their time. And I think in today's time, with all the resources that we have, and employees understand what they want in life, I think this is something that most people can manage, right? And if they cannot manage, there are resources available at their disposal which they can obviously avail, be it counseling service or many others, right? So I think for me, my stand is that moonlighting, again, it cannot have a black and white answer. If we understand the reasons about the apprehensions of the employers, let's address them in the job contract that you have, because the Indian laws does not tell us anything, right? And there we cannot help, but the job contract is where the employers can find solace in. So make sure you understand every employer will have, maybe out of this four reasons that I said, some employers might have different other reasons as well based on their context. So whatever concerns you have, why don't you put that out in the job contract? And then once the employees understand that, they sign it. Now, adhering to this boundary condition, they can moonlight wherever they wish to, right? The only thing is that this should not be breached. So that's my stand on it, how employers should approach this.
See, I had some points on that. From a legal perspective, um, how do you define a workman where you talk about the dual employment clause in the Indian context? It actually applies to workmen, right? It does not apply to um, only factory workers. It applies to workmen. So therefore, it can be extended to someone in a non-factory setting also. But there, the fact comes in that do they have any supervisory capacity? If there is any supervisory capacity, then you don't come under that law, right? So therefore, it leaves that gray area. Second, I mean, my own personal example, once with one of the companies that I was working with, and I had a senior. I mean, I mentioned something about the holiday or something like that, and the person said, "Well, 9 to 12, 9 to 5 jobs are for factory workers, right? You're a manager. For you, there's no 9 to 5." And I was like, okay, so that is another perspective, right? So, and that's not the owner of the company, that's not the proprietor, that's not the top management, that's not HR. That is your senior telling you that you are 24 hours employed because you're now a manager. You're not a worker who does a 9 to 5 job, right? So therefore companies might not have that expectation, but then the hierarchy might have expectations like that, right? Another aspect which I wanted to bring in was about the enforceability of these legal contracts, right? If I sign a non-compete agreement, right, but let's say the company fires me, right? I maybe I work for Wipro. Wipro fires me, and maybe the only job that I'm able to land up is with Infosys. Can Wipro still say that no, you cannot work with Infosys for the next 6 months because you filed a non compete clause with us? Is that enforceable at all? At all? Because now it is my right to livelihood versus your contract, and especially when you put me out on the road in that situation, right? So therefore, that also becomes debatable. How much can that be um, used? But the fact is, a lot of these contract clauses are there to discourage. They cannot prevent, but they're there to discourage. If I see that in my thing, I will be a little more careful. That's the only way, because it is not necessary that all my arguments would get accepted by a court if it goes to court, and I would not want matters to end up in court because I don't want to waste my time, uh, my productive time, which I could have been earning money and doing side hustles, and I don't want to end up spending that time in court and end up paying a lawyer also for that, right? So ultimately, when the primary incentive is financial, you do not want a financial outflow for a lawyer and court fees and stuff. Now, as far as those aspects are concerned, the four aspects that you mentioned about, see, if a person is has access to data, right, has access to confidential data, then you can have specific data uh, sharing related or data access related contracts which you can make binding, right? Because then um, it becomes what intellectual property of the company, and those can be enforceable to a much larger extent because those do not conflict with the individual's personal liberty and stuff, right? Those then have a different value in a court of law also. As far as working with a competitor is concerned, it also depends on what is the level of work that you're doing, right? If someone is a backend developer doing maybe some work with Infosys and ends up doing some small module for Wipro, it's not such a big deal either, right? Problem comes when an employee is not able to understand and limit their conversations or their transfer of information, right? If an employee says, okay, I am an employee here, I'm an employee there, what I do here, my left hand does not know what my right hand does. If an employee is able to maintain that, then again I think this entire conflict of interest becomes redundant, because then there is no conflict, right? You would know how to differentiate between the two. I think one of the biggest concerns which always gets sidelined is about burnout, because right now employees get burned out doing one job, right? And here you've got people who are doing two. And I'm not saying that it leads to burnout to all. I know people who have the capacity to manage three jobs at a time, right? And they'll do all of them well. But that's not the general population. The average person can hardly manage doing one job uh, well enough, right? So, but when this becomes a norm, or when this becomes a, a behavior which people start aspiring towards, right? My neighbor's doing two jobs and he's earning, he just bought a new TV for Diwali, right? When that starts happening, that is when a person who does not have that caliber starts doing side hustles, and then it leads to burnout. Right? So effectively, these are little social time bombs. All the other aspects can still be managed legally and can still be enforced, can appeal to a person's what fairness. But then when it becomes a social norm and when it becomes a behavior that people start aspiring to without having that uh, having the wherewithal to manage that sort of stress, that sort of work time, that is when it, I think, becomes a time bomb and spirals out of control. That aspect of moonlighting, very few people are still addressing.
I agree. Okay, but then I have here a slightly perspective that I had to burnout thing. You're very right. So some people have the ability, some people simply do not have the ability, and this every individual in a way is different. Their tolerance level is different. Uh, for some people, they get burnout just because they are doing that one job which perhaps they're not enjoying, or even if they're enjoying, they had been enjoying, but now it has become pretty much a routine job, something which is pretty peculiar to any corporate job, right? For them, if they are allowed to pursue their passion, right, sometimes that's something that they look forward to in their life, and that perhaps will help them reduce their tendency to get burnt out, right? So for example, I have a friend who says that so every Sunday he plays cricket, right? Again, that's not a good analogy for burnout, but then he said that in my entire week I just look forward to that one Sunday when every morning I'm going to play and open the match for my team, right? This is his motivation in a life in a way which is driving him, right? So, and he does that 5 days a week his work, but the Sunday is what he looks for, and sees that since I look forward to that, rest of the things in my job does not, I don't allow that to get on, because I just look forward, okay, okay, I'll have one day in 3 days time, in 2 days time, in a day's time, right? So for some people, and this can be true, and I'm sure this is true for many people when it comes to moonlighting as well. Maybe they are doing something on the side that they really love to do. Maybe writing, maybe for example content writing, it can be one, right? Or they're giving consulting services, they are doing photography, it can be many things. But that one aspect of their job, even if they're just devoting just 2 hours, or for some people it might be just making videos on social media, right? That gives them so much of pleasure that they can just carry on the entire week without getting burnt out, right? So it's not really the quantum of work someone does, it's really the quality of work that someone does which essentially leads someone to burnout. I mean, if I have something to do that really bogs me down, I will get burned out pretty soon, right? Yeah, please. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So my reply to that is, if someone's doing that, that's, I think that's hardly the concern that people have towards moonlighting. Moonlighting, I mean, the entire issue with moonlighting when it's in the current media is when people are doing the same thing somewhere else. I'm coding at X, I'm coding at Y, right? If I'm coding at X and shooting at Y, I don't think X would even bother. Okay, you're doing whatever you're doing at Y, I don't care. You can be HR at Y and be project manager at X, right? You run recruitment at company Y, and your primary job was being a coder at company X. I don't think company X would create an issue until you start poaching people from that company, right? But if it is interest, then most people would not object. I mean, if I had people I was working with who were to, I mean, maybe employees who were to start doing other things at their free time or post work or whatever, which does not actually threaten my business, then I would say go ahead and do that. If there is any way I can support, even if you want to take a day off without a reason just to do that, go ahead and do that. I mean, at least from an employer's perspective, I would think that way. The entire issue comes when there are people trying to do things for money and replicating the exact resources, and which is where the other fact comes in, right? Of company resources being misused. If I'm using my computer at X and using the same computer at Y, that's a different matter. But if my other interest is photography, even if I'm editing photographs on that primary computer, I don't think my primary employer would have a problem with me using that computer for editing photographs, because that's कुछ घिस तो नहीं रहा basically, right? So,
So here I think, yeah, but then the point problem for an employer here is that how do they distinguish that breed who does it for their passion and just because they love it, and from the breed which does it for their financial stability, right? I think it is very difficult for employers to do that.
true,
So I think what they can perhaps do is that, and I think this is what we had discussed, they cannot have a blanket ban on moonlighting, and they should not have it because then that has its own repercussion. And again, they cannot just allow everyone to moonlight without any checks and balances, right? I think that drawing that fine line is very important, right? That's the very idea that you're talking about, because for example, when you look at and I think there also will can bring in the ethical issue now. Someone like Rishad Premji, he says that moonlighting is plain cheating. And he used the term cheating. Right now, that's a very like a blanket opinion on moonlighting. That if you are moonlighting, whatever may be your motivation, you are basically cheating. Right. But then the question here is that the CEOs of all companies essentially moonlight. They are in the board of directors of different other companies, right?
true,
They travel from one place to another. They give lectures and they are paid for their speaking gigs, right? Some people run multiple companies, even though it might be a group company. They have their so, for example, one of the big examples of moonlighting would be Elon Musk, right? He is a CEO in multiple companies and which are unrelated companies. He doesn't have a board as a holding company as such, right? As far as I know,
true,
these are all individual companies, and he is running those companies. That in a way is moonlighting, right? So it's true for all other companies as well. Even though it might be a holding company, if they are on diversified businesses and you are managing everywhere, you are leading. In a way, it's moonlighting as well, right? That
true,
way, right? And even if you're running just one company, you are in board of directors of different other companies, and you're getting paid for that work. This is also example of moonlighting. So how can you say that means are all of these leaders or CEOs, MDs cheaters? We can't say that, right? So I think before giving those blanket opinions on this, I think it's better to understand the context first, understand the context in which it is being said, and it can, for some cases, it might be cheating. I would say, for example, if you're working for a company and you're passing on information, or you're having conflict of interest with a competing firm, yes, it is cheating, absolutely cheating. But
true,
not all cases of moonlighting can be cheating, right? And I
true.
think that's the both of us are driving on this point that it cannot be, we cannot have a blanket opinion or blanket policies for moonlighting. And every employer has to address this. This cannot go unaddressed. I think what right now we are seeing is that some employers are addressing it in some form. Some employees are uh, simply opening it for own interpretation. If it suits their interest, they will support it. If it doesn't suit, maybe they will say no, you cannot do this and you cannot do that. But nothing is there concretely on paper, right? I
True.
think that's where I think employers need to understand and need to take progressive steps. I think this is the time that we need to do, because it's not a new thing, it's an old thing, but it's time that we rationalize it better. Yeah.
I'll share an example of a friend, a friend's friend actually. The common friend told me about what that person has set up, had set up actually. This was early in my career also. He was working with one of the top consulting firms. I don't know how he was able to find time, but what he did was he took up a shop on rent in one of the malls when the mall culture was still very strong. Right? He took up a shop in one of the malls on rent, paying rent out of his own income, and he made it into a multi-brand footwear shop. Right, so but registered the business in his wife's name. Right now, there again comes that gray area. Anyway, the business was in the wife's name, but he was managing it from the back end. Now, what he did was, no, sorry, he didn't start it as a multi-brand outlet. He got one of the branded companies, Nike, Reebok, someone. He gave that shop to that brand as a franchisee, or he took up the franchisee of that brand. Yeah, I think he took up the franchisee of that brand. Now he was paying out good money to them um, for having a, let's say for an example, a Reebok branded outlet, and he started generating money. There were adequate footfalls. He started generating money. The next thing that he did was he took up a shop at a better location, right up front, opened a multi-brand outlet, right? And now in this multi-brand outlet, he created spaces on the walls, right? So he said, okay, this space on this wall goes to Nike. The next one goes to Adidas. The next one goes to Puma. Now, with that, he was now able to tell the companies, because now this shop was at a prime mall in a prime location. He said, now uh, you want to display your footwear on my wall, you pay me money, right? So effectively, where he was paying money to a brand earlier as a franchisee, he was now able to turn that around and tell them, now you pay money to me if you want your footwear to be displayed here, right? And that business did well. His motivation in doing that was, he said, I work in a private company, right? There's a certain age till which I will be able to work with them. There is a certain, I mean, there is always that gray area about when, how long I would be able to survive in this company. They can give me a 1 month notice, 3 month notice, whatever is the thing, and say bye bye to me. What is it that I have as my own permanent income, right? As my source of income. So that is what motivated him to start this, not in his own name, wife's name, yes, but interestingly, he was able to manage multiple things, paid for the initial investment from his salary, and then ended up maybe earning multiple times over his salary through these investments, through this business thing that he had done. So
But what
moonlighting,
company was
yes,
he
definitely.
working in? I mean, in which business was the company that he was
He
working
he
in?
was in a consulting firm, one of the big four consulting firms,
Okay, okay,
right?
yeah,
So not related to
not
this area at
related.
all,
Mm-hmm.
right? So while you can say he was not working, there was no competing interest. There was, I mean, there was no. He wasn't using any resources of the company. He was, let's say, not doing any wrong doing. The business was in his wife's name. It was not even in his own name that he would have a secondary source of income. He was adding to the family income, right? So all things right, but then I am pretty sure his concentration at the consulting job that he had would get diverted with this other budding business that
Absolutely,
he
it
is
has
starting.
to. It has to get. But I think there, I think what employers. I mean, that's the reason why I think it's important for all employers to have clear sets of targets and roles, responsibilities. I mean, at the end of the day, I cannot control someone's mind. I cannot control someone's psyche, right? All I know is that if I've given a work, and I need you to do that well. If you do that well, how you divert your mind, because everyone's mental or psychological capacity is different, right? For someone who has such a business, as you said, on the side, obviously perhaps most of his energy would go into that. Even in office he might be thinking of that, because it's a proper business. But then if I'm the employer, for me what should matter is that whatever task is being assigned, is that being done well or not? Are my clients happy or not? If they're happy, if that's going well, what's the concern? Right? If it's not going well, that's the time for me to be concerned about. And I think so, that's why I think it's important for also employers to draw a line. What Because every employee has their own rights, and in today's time, given so much of opportunities, if I don't respect my employees' boundaries, they will easily switch. And given the opportunities today, if someone is skilled, they will have a lot of opportunities. And so I think that this kind of moonlighting, I think, should be welcome in a way, right?
And in fact, if you want to discourage someone, then build it into the performance management system where
Yes.
um, if a person is going beyond and devoting their full attention, I'm not saying time, their full attention to your business, then the performance management system should reflect that. If it should be able to detect if a person is not giving full attention during the time the person is doing a job, which will mean maybe quality, which could mean even um, time, etc. Whatever aspect. So the management system should do this. And I mean, I'm not a big proponent of capitalism, but then I think the beauty of capitalism is that what it says is that you should not impose control, right? The control should come from the system, right? The market, the various forces that are there in the economy, the workplace also, they should impose that control, right? Instead of someone standing with a stick and saying, telling everyone to line up, if naturally people line up, if you're able to naturally get people to line up, that is going to be more effective and more what consistent in the long run, right? The typical socialism or the communist ideology of Russia and China, they seem to have somewhere failed and don't have a very, I mean, people don't have a very positive outlook of both of them because they are they're not self-sustaining systems, right? While the pseudo-capitalist economies, I'd say pseudo because there are multiple other aspects also to it. But then when you go by the philosophy of capitalism, it is not just that it is about free economy. It is about free freedom, right? That freedom brings in that control, right? So while my freedom is to do something, somebody else's freedom will make me also act in a certain way, right? So when everyone's free, then I think somewhere it's not entropy, there is order that comes out in the system.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we just have last 10 minutes. Before we end this conversation, I think it will be incomplete if we don't talk of moonlighting in academia.
In
Since
academia.
both of us are academics, and academia in a way thrives on moonlighting. So what's your view on this, and how would you do you think academicians manage their time across multiple things? We can throw light on that.
So I think when it comes to academia, our primary job is to teach, right? Going by the conventional view. It is also to research. Now, when you do research, you are definitely not moonlighting because that is part of your primary work. It goes towards enhancing your teaching. It is a requirement by your own employer, right? So therefore, research is definitely not moonlighting. You have administrative work that is also part of your primary responsibility. That's your diverting attention there is also not moonlighting. Places like JGBS, they actually give credit for administrative work. So that I think is a very forward-looking, positive thing that we have going. Moonlighting would be if, personally for me, the way I understand it in academia would be if I were to start giving guest lectures at some other place, right? But there also, if I am teaching at JGBS and I get to teach at some other place, right? Is that wrong? I don't think it's wrong. If I'm teaching at some other place, I am still imparting information, imparting knowledge, right? Which is my primary motivation to be in academia. Problem becomes that if I use the JGBS name, that because I am from JGBS and therefore somebody invites me for a lecture, then somewhere I am using the JGBS name to get that new project, right? And in that, if I do not share revenue with JGBS, right? Because JGBS is also now sparing me that time to let me go and work someplace, then that becomes ethically wrong, right? So if I am using the JGBS name to get something, if people were to, if institute were to approach me and say, Mr. Sunil George Matthew, we've heard a lot about you and about your experiences. We'd like you to teach our students XYZ course, right? That's different versus them saying, Professor George, you seem to be doing some good work at JGBS. Can we have you deliver a course to our students, right? Now they've come to me because they've heard of me at JGBS, heard of what JGBS has, and they are also taking JGBS to be that uh, mark that, okay, minimum quality is maintained, right? So in that case, if I do not share revenue with JGBS, I think that becomes unethical for me. But if I am, then and if provided JGBS also wants that, if they say that okay, we do not have a problem with you taking up additional projects somewhere else, as long as your primary responsibilities here, if you're teaching 6 credits, then as long as your classes for the 6 credits are going okay, we don't have a problem what you do with the rest of your time. Sorry. And if there is a drop in quality because I'm diverting my attention, it is just a 4 month period within which that uh, drop in quality will also get registered through the student feedback, right? In fact, not even that 4 month period. fortnightly feedback is also generated, right? So that would start reflecting in those fortnightly reports. So, and therefore checks can be done for that, right? So I think in academia it should not be such a big reason. It is definitely not a big deal, especially in academia.
So in
Your view,
academia, yes, in academia, moonlighting also goes beyond the guest lectures. I think there are professors who have their own firms,
consulting.
right? I mean, if you see, not just consulting. So in fact, right now the IITs, the ISCs are actually formally allowing that. So so previously, when say in sciences, when someone builds has a patent, they build a new technology. Previously, it was about you have the patent for it. Now you lend it to someone else who wants to build that company by themselves, right? But right now that they are becoming now more progressive, especially in India, and that's already there in the top universities around the world, where now professors are asked, like, if you wish to actually commercialize it, why don't you have a stake in the company and you go and run the operations of the company as well, right? So obviously their teaching load and other load is managed that way. But the point is, can we call it moonlighting if the employer is explicitly allowing you to do that, right? Even at the cost of, they're not even demanding that you share any revenue with us, because the idea is that for an employer, when say for an university, when your any of your employee that is a professor goes and builds up some good technology and builds a good company, it also adds to the branding of that university, right? It also adds to the intellectual stamina of the university, right? That's one. Second, it also builds a culture of innovation within the university, that our people are doing this great stuff, right? So not everything, I think, can be measured through tangible in money only. A lot of other things also goes into why moonlighting in academia is allowed, right? For example, if you talk of the guest lecture, that okay, for example, let's talk of a top institution around the world. Yes, the professors there will have a lot of brand equity just because they're associated with that institution and they will be called. The point is, for most of them actually, and I would say for a large majority of them, they get different opportunities because of their association with the brand. Okay, not just guest lectures. For example, they are asked to review a thesis, and it's something that they are being paid for, right? And that even the university doesn't ask for revenue sharing, right? So in a way, that's moonlighting, that you are doing for something else, but you have got it because you are an professor working in a certain institution, right? Look at the IITs, IIMs. Many professors get to review thesis just because they're associated with that particular institution. Right? And I think the universities would actually like that our professors are getting such calls, getting such opportunities, right? So I think moonlighting in academia also, the boundary conditions are there. So some employers have it specifically written that if you're doing any consulting service using our name, you have to share revenues. When it comes to lectures, many employers do not have anything. You said that you are free to do any paid, unpaid lecture. The only thing is that it should not hamper with your duties in the institution, right? If you do that, so on a weekend or on a day when you don't have a class or other commitments, we are okay with that. I mean, that's there sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly mentioned. So I think when it comes to academia, we are expected to moonlight in a way, right? Because all the experiences that you gain from consulting work, from running your own company, from your guest lectures, from other kind of stuff that you do, you bring that wisdom in the class. You bring that wisdom in the class. You, when you write your own intellectual contributions, be it in terms of research papers, newspaper articles, those, that wisdom shows up in that, right? And that adds to the university's own intellectual pursuit. I mean, why is a Harvard, is because, or an MIT, because of the great innovations that have happened, not just from students, from faculty, and from the ecosystem that has come up, right? Without that, it's not, the Ivy Leagues would not have been the Ivy Leagues. The placements just do not make an institution. It's mainly the intellectual strength that an institution has, right? So I think this is a cue that also the private sector, and more than that, the government can take, because government strictly prohibits their employees from moonlighting, right? For the some places it is justified. For example, bureaucrats who is literally in 24/7 job, for them obviously moonlighting is a different thing when they have a entire place to run and everything. But there are different kinds of government jobs where perhaps moonlighting can be allowed. since it is not allowed, what people do is that they open up something in the name of their spouses or some family members, and they still do it. So I think rather than having a blanket ban on it, both private sector and the government sector can take some cue from the from academia here for a change, and they can have much more progressive policies for moonlighting, right?
In
So
fact,
any parting
most of
comments?
the most of the research in this world, most of the development that has happened has been because of people at employed at educational institutions who have gone beyond just teaching, right? So science and technology, most of the research happened in universities, right?
Yes,
And then they came out to the private sector. A lot of the medicine research also, right? Even the COVID vaccines, they were most of them were funded, or either the initial research happened at educational institutions. So I think very good perspective that you brought, that this is an industry which actually thrives, not otherwise. But then the ethos of the industry is on moonlighting, not moonlighting, but maybe going beyond your defined terms, right? Moonlighting has a negative connotation to it because of the fact that something is being hidden from your primary employer. As long as something is not hidden, whether it be moonlight or sunlight, right? Whatever, however you do it, as long as your employer knows and you do it, I think it is all positive. And I do not see any place, right? I mean, even in the government service, somebody could go ahead and do, right? There are bureaucrats who write novels, right?
yes,
So, and
that's
that is positive
yeah,
to the government. Maybe they might have a requirement that, okay, do not show the government in a bad light wrongfully, right? Then if you're showing the truth, then I don't think the government would also have a big issue about it, right? As long as you're
yes. To deal with that, as you mentioned, the secretive nature of it, I think when you have progressive policies and the employer knows, okay, these are the policies and I'm not breaching them, they can openly put it out. I mean, most of the things that we
true,
have is because there are not enough progressive policies towards it. For example, someone who works in
true,
Swiggy now can openly claim that I'm moonlighting, right? So I think this
true,
is something that the government and most of the private sector need to take. And I understand these policies cannot be again same for or uniform for everyone. You have to look at your own context before you do that, right? So
true.
I think we have put our points of views on this, and I think both of us are on the same page on this, that it cannot be a blanket yes or blanket no. It has to
True.
be terms and conditions should be applied. But overall, I think moonlighting is not something that should be completely shammed or treated as quote unquote cheating. Right? It
True.
cannot be termed that way. And I think here industry academia has a lot to offer in that. Right, a lot of insights. So great, Sunil. I think with this we come to the end of today's discussion. So we'll meet again next week. Right, that's great.
Yes, and I hope we start seeing a few comments from people, because
Yes,
we don't want it to be just us, right?
yes,
Brickbats and bouquets both welcome,
both
right?
of them.
Somewhere
Yeah,
it'll help us also go beyond our limited discussion, right?
very great.
Right.